Ridges sighed. "Shoot," he said. "I might as well make one too." He guffawed with embarrassment after he spoke and bent over his pack. His laughter had been loud and braying. Stanley imitated him. "Wah!" Ridges looked up and said mildly, "Well, shoot, I just can't help the way I laugh. It's good enough, I reckon." He guffawed again to show his goodwill, but the laughter was much more chastened this time. When there was no answer, he began to dig. He had a short, powerful body which was shaped like a squat pillar, for it tapered at neither end. His face was round and dumpy with a long, slack jaw that made his mouth gape. His eyes goggled placidly to increase the impression he gave of dull-wittedness and good temper. As he dug, his motions were aggravatingly slow. He dumped each shovelful in exactly the same place, and paused every time to look about before he bent down again. There was a certain wariness about him, as though he were accustomed to practical jokes, expected them to be played on him. Stanley watched him impatiently. "Hey, Ridges," he said, looking at Sergeant Brown for approbation. "If you were sitting on a fire, I guess you'd be too lazy to piss and put it out." Ridges smiled vaguely. "Reckon so," he said quietly, watching Stanley walk toward him and stand over the hole to examine his progress. Stanley was a tall youth of average build with a long face, which looked vain, usually, and scornful and a little uncertain. He would have been handsome if it had not been for his long nose and sparse black mustache. He was only 19. "Christ, you'll be digging all day," Stanley said with disgust. His voice was artificially rough, like that of an actor who fumbles for a conception of how soldiers talk. Ridges made no answer. Patiently, he continued digging. Stanley watched him for another minute, trying to think of something clever to say. He was beginning to feel ridiculous just standing there, and on an impulse kicked some sand into Ridges' foxhole. Silently, Ridges shoveled it out, not breaking his rhythm. Stanley could feel the men in the platoon watching him. He was a little sorry he had started, for he wasn't certain whether the men sided with him. But he had gone too far to renege. He kicked in quite a bit of sand. Ridges laid down his shovel and looked at him. His face was patient, but there was some concern in it. "What you trying to do, Stanley?" he asked. "You don't like it?" Stanley sneered. "No, sir, I don't." Stanley grinned slowly. "You know what you can do." Red had been watching with anger. He liked Ridges. "Listen, Stanley," Red shouted. "Wipe your nose and start acting like a man." Stanley swung around and glared at Red. The whole thing had gone wrong. He was afraid of Red, but he couldn't retreat. "Red, you can blow it out," he said. "Speaking of blowing it out," Red drawled, "will you tell me why you bother cultivating that weed under your nose when it grows wild in your asshole?" He spoke with a heavy, sarcastic brogue, which had the men laughing before he even finished. "Good old Red," Wilson chuckled. Stanley flushed, took a step toward Red. "You ain't going to talk to me that way." Red was angry, eager for a fight. He knew he could whip Stanley. There was something which he was not ready to face, and he let his anger ride over it. "Boy, I could break you in half," he warned Stanley. Brown got to his feet. "Listen, Red," he interrupted. "You weren't spoiling that damn hard to have a fight with Croft." Red paused and was disgusted with himself. That was it. He stood there indecisively. "No, I wasn't," he said. "But there ain't any man I won't fight." He wondered if he had been afraid of Croft. "Ah, fuck it," he said, turning away. But Stanley realized that Red would not fight, and he walked after him. "This ain't settled for me," he said. Red looked at him. "Go blow, will you?" To his amazement, Stanley heard himself saying, "What's the matter? You going